It's like the kickoff for a football game. I was waiting for the official to go down. So it just came down. Welcome. My name is Greg Peterson. I am the president of the Robert H. Jackson Center. And the Robert H. Jackson Center is thrilled, absolutely thrilled, to host this special dinner to commemorate the 50th anniversary of Brown versus Board. The Robert H. Jackson Center was established in 2001, less than 3 years ago, and is designed to advance the legacy of Robert H. Jackson through education, exhibitry, and by pursuing the relevancy of his ideas for our present generation. One of our panelists this morning wrote in a 1958 Virginia Law Review article the following: "It is not too early to predict that his already considerable stature as a judge will grow, not because of his very quotable aphorisms and barbs, but because he possessed a sound and independent judgment. He bestowed a deep respect, even reverence, upon the law he administered. He had a seasoned lawyer's approach to facts, and he understood the true meaning of freedom, that it must be gauged by the freedom sought and not by the group seeking it, that it applies equally to all, and that it carries responsibility." To E. Barrett Prettyman, Jr., we thank you for that guiding star which has led the Robert H. Jackson Center towards a vision of what the legacy of Justice Jackson would be. The event today is the culmination of a series of events sponsored by the Robert H. Jackson Center over 4 months, celebrating this seminal decision of Brown versus Board. We're blessed here. I want to introduce a few folks without whom we would not be at the Robert H. Jackson Center as we know it today. They are the folks who really gave us that extra lift, that wind underneath our wings. And to Kay Kappa, on behalf of your late husband, Carl Kappa, we can't thank you for supporting Carl and for certainly Carl supporting us to make the Robert H. Jackson Center possible. Thank you very much. Betty Lene, she's not here yet, okay. Also in attendance, Juanita Bratton. Juanita Bratton's husband, Dan Bratton, was our first executive director. And Dan Bratton, who had recently resigned from this venerable institution of Chautauqua, after 16 years, chose his lot to join us as its first executive director and gave us immediate credibility, not only in the community, but in Washington as well, with various visits and conversations with Justice O'Connor at the very formative stages of the Jackson Center. So to Juanita, thank you for permitting Dan during that period of time which he was available to us, because that support was invaluable. And in fact, I got to tell you, Dan, during that period of time, wrote his vision of the Jackson Center, even while he was struggling with cancer. We have that vision, and it's that vision which is our prototype as we look forward. So Juanita, thank you for supporting Dan, and Dan supported that. We have a lot of celebrities in our midst here, but we also have some of the family of Robert H. Jackson, and I would like to introduce them at this time. Grandson Tom Loftus. Tom, if you would please stand, and wherever you are. Tom. Tom came in from Virginia today just for this event. Thank you very much, Tom. And Julia Craighill, granddaughter of Robert Jackson, similarly came in just moments ago. And her daughter, and also the great-granddaughter of Justice Jackson, Julie. Thank you very much, Julie. And finally, our contact with the Jackson family right here in Jamestown, one of our board members, his longtime nephew, and sort of our source and muse for the Jackson history, Harold Adams. Harold, please stand. Now at this time, I'd like to introduce for invocation the Reverend Dr. Joan Brown Campbell, Director, Department of Religion, Chautauqua Institution.
It is a special privilege to be asked tonight to give the invocation on this particular occasion, which so relates to my own life and to the many, many times that I have dealt with this issue and been privileged to walk by the side of Martin Luther King. So it is with more than a little emotion that you asked me to pray tonight, and I am grateful for that opportunity. Let us bow our heads. The scripture tells us that we are told to seek mercy, to seek justice, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with our God. And it is in that spirit that we pray. God of justice, you call us constantly to balance the scales. You call us to right the wrongs of our society. You call us to walk beside those whose lives are burdened with injustice that is not of their making. God of mercy, thank God you are a God of mercy. You forgive us when we look the other way. You continue to love us when we fail to speak the word of truth. You embrace all those whose lives are diminished forever by acts of insensitivity and sometimes even cruelty. God of love, God of yesterday, today, and tomorrow, this night we offer thanksgiving for all who righted the wrongs brought about by our foolish need to divide your whole people by the issue of race. This night, we dispel the darkness of prejudice with the incandescent light of human courage. For all who walk in that light, we are this night and forever, today and tomorrow, forever abundant in our thanks. Amen.
To honor America and also to have the Pledge of Allegiance to the flag, I introduce Josh Moss, 16-year-old Eagle Scout, Troop 126, Mayville, New York.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. Wait a minute. I didn't lose control of this crowd yet, did I? Gee. Hold on. There's a few more things. These events do not occur without a great deal of support from volunteers, a great deal of support from sponsors, people who really believe in the Robert H. Jackson Center and events like this. Your program in the back has a list of the variety of folks who were involved. Feel free to refer to that throughout the course of the evening, and we thank all of them for making this possible. But specific attention should be drawn to some of the corporate sponsors who made an extraordinary effort to make an event honoring Brown versus Board, including National Fuel, Cummins Foundation, HSBC Bank, the Northern Chautauqua Community Foundation, the New York Bar Foundation, and Phillips Lytle. In addition, we could not do many of our events without reference to Chautauqua Institution. Chautauqua Institution has been with the Robert Jackson Center in what I like to coin a symbiotic relationship right from the beginning, from the initial executive director with Dan Bratton, and throughout and right up through its current executive director and president, President Tom Becker. We're honored to be at Chautauqua. We have been honored to be at Chautauqua from events which have included the Chief Justice of the United States, including law clerks who were with Justice Jackson in Nuremberg, Fred Korematsu, a case which is very relevant today. And all of this has occurred in cooperation and in partnership with Chautauqua Institution. Now I'd like to introduce the president of Chautauqua Institution, Tom Becker. Tom?
Good evening. I'm reluctant to hold you back from your salads and bread at this point. It seems cruel, to tell you the truth. For those of us who have suffered through Greg's dalliances with passion prior to this, you know, his signatures of presidents and baseball players and others, he finally found a cause that has some really serious meaning to the rest of us. All right, so this is not a roast. I do want to take a second, though, to talk about Dan. Dan Bratton was 16 years the president of Chautauqua Institution, and an enormous human being in terms of his depth of commitment to citizenship in this country and his genuine basis of humanity. There are other people in this room that served him for a period of years, and I had that great pleasure, and it's one of the great values of my life, to tell you the truth. When he retired, not resigned, from Chautauqua Institution, he took on the Jackson Center cause with all of the fervor that he had applied to us. It had meaning to him, it had depth, it spoke to his wonderful combination of intelligence and humanity, and he dug into it in just that way. And the fact that he was taken from us in such a quick fashion is a lesson for us all about how short life is, about how plans don't quite work out just the way we think they will, and about how much we apply to things and we ultimately don't have so much control. But I welcome you to a place that is all about hope. You know, it really is. This institution is dedicated to the idea that our lives really are in service to others, and the purpose of that life is bigger than we can ever imagine, and that our effort is well engaged in knowing that and knowing it more deeply every day. There's a window over here where Thomas Edison used to dive out of this room when he didn't want to be bothered by other people. There have been people in this place that have been totally invested in improving the lives of human beings for a long time. And a fair amount of that intersection that Chautauqua carves out is all about the odd combination of faith and reason. We were founded by scientists who had a deep faith in why they lived. And it's odd, you know, we've come to this point in our lives, and those two sectors have been set out as opposite poles. They are not. They are a lively combination in which, God bless us, we can find some wisdom. And it happens here. I would point out to you that part of what is happening tonight is the recognition of a deep sense of history where a wrong in this country was righted, I would argue temporarily. And what we face today on the very issues that we were struggling with at the time of Brown versus Board of Education, they're alive today. They're more insidious in some ways. They're harder. We can't get at them maybe in as clean a fashion, but they're alive today, and they demand our attention. We are all Sisyphus, you know. We're all rolling that damn rock up the hill, and it keeps coming down. We've been doing it forever. And the real quality of our lives are measured in our effort, you know. They're measured in our commitment to doing the right thing at the right time and in the right way. And this summer, when you come back in the 9th week of this season, when we look back at the 20th century, we're looking at the major trends of the 20th century. We're featuring Sandra Day O'Connor on the context of law in the 20th century, and I can't imagine that she's going to pass this particular decision without a serious reference to its importance. In that same week, indeed the day before, Congressman John Lewis, a man who, while praying, had his head bashed in, is going to talk about civil rights as a major trend in the 20th century. So I invite you to enjoy this great place, to come back this summer and dine in the ongoing brilliance of the contest with ideas that matter a lot, and also to recognize, as this place does, I think, down to its bones, that what really matters about all of this is relationships between people. We have children here of a man who decided enough is enough is enough, and fought it. And there are children that live the legacy of that. And that goes on in every facet of our lives. It's all about relationships. And Chautauqua Institution welcomes you. We're delighted with the collaboration with the Jackson Center. We're thrilled with its founding. We're very excited with the way it's going, and we hope to be of some assistance. Welcome to Chautauqua.
Thanks, Tom. I always listen to Tom, and one of the things Tom has more than not so subtly mentioned, go ahead and eat. We're going to keep plowing through here because we have an awful big agenda, so feel free to go dive into your Jackson Center. I'd like to, at this point, as we mentioned, Dan Bratton was our first executive director. It's okay to eat. Go ahead and eat. Our first executive director, Dan Bratton, but we've been equally blessed by our second, Raleigh Kidder. Raleigh Kidder, former assemblyman, has taken us to a whole new level. You're not going to announce any candidacy tonight, are you? Raleigh Kidder, our executive director.
Don't worry about that. You know, you're here on Robert H. Jackson's stomping grounds. He loved this place. He was in this hotel. That amphitheater you're going to be in tomorrow, he spoke in that amphitheater. He listened to lectures in that amphitheater. And I thought that Barrett Prettyman's comment this morning at the Jackson Center, that he was a practical person. You know, it reflects where we live here. Those of you who don't live here, you get a sense of it now, don't you? This is a small town, rural, sort of backwater place of America, but it's a beautiful place, and one of the beauties of it is that you meet people from all walks of life. And Jackson, I think, looked upon this place as his university. As you know, he didn't have the money to go to college. He took an extra year of high school, to Jamestown High School. He met some wonderful teachers who introduced him to the classics and to good writing and reading. And then he went to 1 year of law school and came back and clerked his way to the bar. When he was 20 years of age and 21, he became a lawyer. He learned, and he often admitted it, the practice of law at the expense of his clients here in Chautauqua County. And, but he, you know, the lessons of life that he learned here, he learned them here. And he learned them up here at this courthouse 3 miles up the road in Mayville. And in Jackson's life, the way as it developed, I mean, he said, well, you know, the lessons I've learned here, if they work in Mayville, they should work in Albany at the Court of Appeals. He practiced at the Court of Appeals. And he went to Washington, and he ended up at the Supreme Court. And he said, you know, the principles that I learned about the law and about the way things work with the law and his reverence for the law, if they worked in Albany and in Jamestown, why wouldn't they work here in Washington? And then, of course, ultimately, he went to Nuremberg, and he said the same thing. You know, if people can resolve their conflicts in a peaceable way in a place like Mayville, Washington, why can't they do it internationally? And he stepped out on international law. And if we want to carry on Jackson's legacy, we feel at the Jackson Center, we need to focus on his legacy, which was his reverence for the law and where it took him. And Greg Peterson and John Barrett were in Nuremberg earlier this year, and we think that the Nuremberg legacy is something that we're going to have to follow here at the Jackson Center. Of course, Jackson, his understanding of the law led him in other directions. We had a wonderful event at the Jackson Center today, and one of our other emphases is to help kids learn what justice and law mean in today's world, in their world. And of course, this is a celebration of the 50th anniversary of the Brown decision. Jackson, prior to our meeting here tonight, Kathy Crocker, I don't know if I think she's here someplace. You want to raise your hand, Kathy? She did an article in the Post-Journal in which she talked about another Chautauqua County resident who lived over here in Mayville, who was a Civil War veteran, and he was also a lawyer and an author. And after the Civil War, he was wounded at Bull Run. He went back and lived in the Carolinas, and he began to take up the cause of the freed slaves who were obviously having a very tough go of it, and he wrote books about it. And in 1896, as a lawyer, he represented Homer Plessy in Plessy versus Ferguson, and he lost at the Supreme Court. And here's another lawyer from this area. He's there 60 years later, Robert H. Jackson. And in her research, Kathy found this letter that Jackson, he always stayed in touch with his pals back here in Jamestown and Chautauqua County, and he wrote him a letter in 1950, 4 years before the case came down. But he was obviously thinking about it, because this is what he said in his letter to Ernie Cawcroft and Walter Edson. He said, "The Plessy case arose in Louisiana, and how Tourget got into it I have not learned. In any event, I have gone to his old brief filed here, and there's no argument made today that he would not make to the court. He says justice is pictured blind, and her daughter, the law, ought at least to be colorblind." And of course, Jackson went on to become a part of the majority, or the unanimous opinion in Brown v. Board. But Jackson's struggling with this issue of separate but equal. It was somebody 60 years ago from Chautauqua County was struggling with it. And here we are 50 years from Jackson. And what are we talking about today? Separate but equal. And we're very honored today, as a part of our educational program, in that part of Jackson's legacy, to have 5 students here from across New York State. For the first time, we decided to take an educational program statewide, and we worked with the New York Bar Association. And first, I'd like to recognize the people that are here from Albany: Debbie Sheo, Deborah Taylor, Mary Miller, Mark Morris, and Peyton Gibson. We're all a part of either organizing this essay contest or judging it. And I'd like you to just stand or raise your hands. We want to recognize you. And coming up next on the program will be an actual introduction of the students. They're here with their parents, their aunts. We had one young man who's here who came up from Manhattan this morning, and we had to get his brother out of Rutgers University. They had to have somebody over 18 to come with him, and he made it, so they're all 5 here. And they'll be here tomorrow, and on Friday they're going to be honored at the New York State Court of Appeals in Albany. And not all of them, but most of them we think will be able to come down and be honored in Albany. So that's what the Jackson Center is all about. You know, I thought today, as we sat in the Jackson Center auditorium, and I listened to those law clerks who hadn't been together for 50 years, and here they are at the table together again tonight. I said, you know, if Jackson was here, Robert Jackson, he knew all these guys. And he would probably have looked down and said, "Good job." Nice going. And he would have given them a big thank you. And I think he would have said the same for these 5 essay contest winners, because there were 465 entries, and these are the 5 winners of the 465. And they struggled with this question. The question they had to write on was, can separate ever be equal? That's not an easy topic. It wasn't easy 50 years ago. It's still not easy. And I think that Jackson finally would probably say to all of us, if he were here tonight, listen, keep struggling with these issues, keep moving us ahead in these areas, because if I were here, that's what I'd want to have being done. And we thank you all for coming and supporting us tonight. Thank you.
By the way, we received a message from an individual who was near and dear to the Brown versus Board case. A letter addressed to me, Mr. Peterson. Thank you very much for your kind letter and invitation to visit the Robert H. Jackson Center. I held Justice Jackson in very high regard, and at times when I felt particularly vulnerable in my arguments before the court, Justice Jackson seemed to point the way to safe ground. Please extend my best to everyone, and signed Robert Carter, and Judge Robert Carter, United States District Judge, who I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, Cheryl and Linda, but didn't he argue the Brown case? In Topeka, yeah. So he was directly related to that process. As Raleigh indicated, we were blessed to have this first-of-a-kind essay contest through the Robert H. Jackson Center. And Philip Slidell, my firm. Thank you, Philip Slidell. Let's give him a nice hand. Thank you for that. A variety of my bosses are here today. Together with the New York State Bar Foundation, conducted a statewide essay contest in recognition of the 50th anniversary of the historic Supreme Court case of Brown versus Board of Education. And as Raleigh indicated, the topic was an essay. It was open to high school students throughout the state studying American history and currently enrolled in an American history or government class. The subject of the essay, Can Separate Ever Be Equal? And the entrants needed to demonstrate in their essay an understanding of the history and importance of the Supreme Court ruling in the case. By the way, the 5 winners, their essays are in today's Jamestown Post-Journal, and I believe we'll have them up on the Robert H. Jackson Center website soon. I'd like to recognize and I'm going to list all 5 names and have them come up at this time. But first, I'd like to ask Michael Taylor, who is the essay coordinator, come join me. Michael? Michael? Oh, there he is. Thanks, Mike. Then I'd like to have the following folks come up so they can be recognized. Each of them will be receiving a certificate together with a $500 savings bond and an opportunity, as Raleigh indicated, to meet the Chief Judge of the Court of Appeals and actually the court, and I believe the governor will be there and Lieutenant Governor, all this Friday. So the following people, please come forward. Christina Kiefer from Rochester, New York. Anne Marie McLean from Lower Hudson, New York region, Highland High School. Maya Moyer from Northeast New York region. Maya. Megan Sherlock from Liverpool. And Max Velez from Brooklyn. While Michael's handing them out, look at, nobody takes photos when I'm up here. What is this? Hold on. Step back. Well, just for the rest of us, while they're doing that presentation, let me just tell you what I thought was a very significant event that occurred this morning. After the clerks concluded the event, which was, by the way, will be televised on C-SPAN, which was a terrific morning for us. Every one of these 5 winners came prepared with a question to ask of the clerks. And the interchange among the clerks and among the students was riveting. And it also was filmed, and that also will be seen on, I think, the BOCES network in New York State. But it was just magnificent, and then the clerks started asking questions of them. And I'm not sure you were ready for that. Did a wonderful job answering. I'm not sure I'd want Harvard professor Frank Sander to turn around and ask me questions. I remember law school where you get the white knuckles. It was tough. So they did a magnificent job, and ladies and gentlemen, and to all the proud parents and aunts and uncles and chaperones who all made extra efforts to come here tonight to enjoy this wonderful opportunity and to meet Cheryl and Linda. Later on, hopefully later on, we'll get a chance for a little photo op if that's possible. But thank you very much, and congratulations, one and all. Thanks, Mike. To introduce our honored guest, an individual who was at the platform, 1045 Chautauqua this past year, Professor John Q. Barrett. John Q. Barrett is no stranger to Chautauqua Institution, certainly no stranger to the Robert H. Jackson Center. Professor Barrett is a professor of law at St. John's University in New York and the Robert H. Jackson Center's Elizabeth Lene Fellow. He discovered, edited, and introduced Justice Jackson's That Man, an insider's portrait of Franklin D. Roosevelt. That Man, Jackson's previously unknown and never published memoir of FDR and the New Deal, is a Book of the Month Club and a History Book Club main selection. That Man has been a topic of much discussion, having been covered by NPR, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, New York Times, all favorable, wonderful reviews. John is a graduate of, I don't want to be too formal or personal here. Professor Barrett's a graduate of Georgetown, Harvard, and was a law clerk to Judge A. Leon Higginbottom, Jr. of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Third Circuit. An associate counsel in the Office of Independent Counsel, Lawrence E. Walsh, during that Iran-Contra affair, and counselor to the Inspector General in the United States Department of Justice. Currently, John is writing a biography of Justice Jackson that will include the first inside account of his year away from the Supreme Court as the American chief prosecutor at the Nuremberg trial. I can't tell you how honored I am not only to introduce John, but to call him a friend, and the Robert H. Jackson Center calling you a friend, because you've given us that real sense of scholarship, instant credibility, not only here, but when he's on book signing tours, and the first thing that comes out of everybody's mouth is Professor of Law, St. John's University, and the Elizabeth S. Lene Fellow at the Robert H. Jackson Center, and that, to me, is cachet, and it's just an honor. Professor Barrett.
Thank you, Greg, and thank you all very much. It, of course, is an honor and a great pleasure to be back in this very special place, Chautauqua Institution, Jamestown. I just call it Jackson Land. I do insist that you continue eating, and as this course is done, dive into the next one. My privilege this evening is to introduce three special groups that are with us this evening. Those groups are the clerks, the spirits, and the sisters. Let me begin first with the clerks, the gentlemen who I had the privilege of sitting with during an extraordinary conversation this morning. Many of you were there. And those who weren't will be able to watch it. And I really think something happened there that was not only wonderful and interesting, but was new. I'm startled in hindsight that no one had ever invited these guys to have this conversation, and what they were able to put together and really work together to discuss adds to our knowledge of this very important decision that we celebrate in this 50th anniversary year. The four law clerks who are with us this evening. First, John David Fassett. John Fassett, a New York native, is a graduate of the University of Rochester. He served in the military during World War II, began Yale Law School, and then was interrupted by a recall to military service during Korea. finished his education at Yale Law School, and then became a clerk to Supreme Court Justice Stanley Reed, and was with Reed, of course, for the term, October term 1953, which was the year in which Brown versus Board of Education was decided. Following his clerkship with Reed, Jack Fassett returned to New Haven, where he began to practice with the law firm of Wiggin and Dana. After a significant and very successful tenure there, he moved into the business world, serving as a corporate executive and rising to become the CEO and chairman of the board of the United Illuminating Company in New Haven. Connecticut Electricity, thank you, Jack Fassett. He's also a biographer himself. He's the author of the definitive and really voluminous and majestic biography of his boss, Stanley Reed. The book is New Deal Justice, The Life of Stanley Reed. Jack is now retired and lives in North Carolina. It's an honor to have him here this evening. Jack Fassett. I'm also pleased to note that Jack is here with us tonight, as he has been through most of his life, with his wonderful wife, Betty, herself a veteran of our nation's service during World War II, a delightful person, Betty Fassett. We're delighted to have you here. The second clerk I have the privilege of introducing is Frank Sander. Frank Sander has an extraordinary personal story that he told us in a compressed and very understated way early this afternoon. He was born in Stuttgart, Germany in 1927, a German Jew. In the aftermath of Kristallnacht, his family, in a story that I'm sure is extensive and much more extraordinary, got out, individually, seriatim, but in total, first to England and ultimately to the United States. He graduated from high school in Brookline, Mass., became a Harvard College graduate, a Harvard Law School graduate, with U.S. Army service in the midst of that, and then a law clerk, first to a United States Court of Appeals Judge, Calvert Magruder, and then to Justice Felix Frankfurter, again during the October 1953 term of the Supreme Court, during which Brown was decided. Following his clerkship with Justice Frankfurter, Frank Sander practiced law, first with the Department of Justice, and then with a law firm in Boston. And then in 1959, no doubt influenced by, steered by, and benefiting from the guiding hand on the elbow of Felix Frankfurter, he moved into the workforce that was once Felix Frankfurter's himself. He became a professor of law at Harvard Law School in 1959. Frank Sander still teaches actively. He is the Bussey Professor of Law at Harvard. He is the director of the Harvard Law School Program on Dispute Resolution, and it's a pleasure to welcome him this evening. Frank Sander. The third law clerk is a returning guest to Chautauqua Institution and to the Jackson Center, for he is E. Barrett Prettyman, Jr., Justice Robert H. Jackson's final law clerk. Frank Sander actually mentioned this morning that his boss, Felix Frankfurter, had no children, and so for Frankfurter, the law clerks, who were all men, were his pseudo-sons. It is not an exaggeration to say that Barrett Prettyman, Jackson's final law clerk, was somebody who, although Jackson had his own children, was most near and dear to that boss. Barrett Prettyman is a native of Washington, D.C. He's a graduate of Yale College and the University of Virginia Law School. Following his graduation from Virginia, Jackson hired him as a solo law clerk. I will note that these other fellows all had a sidekick to split the load, although not on the Brown case, which they each principally handled. Barrett Prettyman was Jackson's only clerk during the 1953 term and then beginning the 1954 term, during which Jackson suddenly and tragically died of a heart attack. Following Jackson's death, Prettyman clerked for Justice Frankfurter briefly, and then for Jackson's successor, Justice John Marshall Harlan. So in 2 terms at the court, Barrett Prettyman clerked for 3 Supreme Court justices. Following those clerkships, he joined the law firm of Hogan and Hartson in Washington, D.C., becoming a partner. He left Hogan to serve the government during the Kennedy administration in the Department of Justice, where he was a colleague of a guest I'll introduce later this evening. Returned to Hogan and Hartson, and is an accomplished Supreme Court litigator. He's also an officer of the Supreme Court Historical Society. He served a tenure as the Inspector General of the District of Columbia, and he is today of counsel to Hogan and Hartson. Barrett Prettyman gave an extraordinary lecture at this podium in this room last October about Justice Jackson's work deciding and drafting and thinking about the Brown case. And that discussion really was a key part of the planning and the seed that blossomed into today and tomorrow's event. Barrett Prettyman, welcome back to the Jackson Center in Chautauqua. The fourth law clerk who's with us this evening is Earl Pollack. Earl Pollack, a native of Iowa, graduated from the University of Minnesota and from Northwestern University's law school. At the beginning of that summer of 1953, he became a law clerk to the Chief Justice of the United States, Fred Vinson. Chief Justice Vinson died suddenly and unexpectedly that September, and after a brief period of uncertainty, once President Eisenhower had appointed the successor Chief Justice, Earl Warren re-employed or continued to employ the clerks who had been with Chief Justice Vinson. And so for the bulk of the process culminating in the May 17th Brown decision, Earl Pollack was with Earl Warren as his principal clerk working on that majestic project. Earl Pollack actually stayed for a second term with Earl Warren, and so was part of the process that culminated in Brown 2, the remedial phase of the case. Following his Supreme Court clerkship, Earl Pollack practiced law in the Department of Justice, and then moved to Chicago and went into private practice there with the law firm of Sonnenschein, Nath, and Rosenthal. He's an antitrust specialist, became a senior officer in the American Bar Association, taught and lectured widely, is now retired living in Sarasota, Florida, where he's president of the Florida West Coast Symphony, which in some ways seems connected to Chautauqua. Each clerk contributed something extraordinary today, and there is no understating the responsibility here. The author of the Supreme Court opinion in Brown versus Board of Education is Earl Warren, the Chief Justice of the United States. But it is also not an understatement to note explicitly that the clerk whose pen augmented, assisted, completed that opinion that we celebrate is Earl Pollack. Earl Pollack, welcome to the Jackson Center in Chautauqua. I'm not hearing your forks, and maybe they haven't served anything, but that's part one of my introductions. Those were the clerks. My second group is the spirits, and I actually have about 14 who I will mention somewhat briefly. The first, already touched on by Raleigh Kidder, is Albion W. Tourget, American novelist, carpetbagger, judge, lawyer, failed Reconstructionist who fled north to live in Mayville, attorney who lost as co-counsel Plessy versus Ferguson. An interesting addition to the work that Kathy Crocker has done and the remarks that Raleigh made is that Jackson was guided to Tourget's role in the Plessy case by one of the leading academics of that day, the early 1950s, as Jackson struggled with the history of the framing of the 14th Amendment. It was a bit of a detour, really, but I think a greatly personally motivating development for Jackson to learn about a Chautauqua County forebear who had played a role and written the winning argument in history, if not in 1896. Albion Tourget is a spirit here this evening. A second spirit is Thurgood Marshall. Thurgood Marshall was director counsel of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. The Brown case, as you know, was 5 cases. 5 different leading attorneys were litigating those cases up the line and presented pieces of the arguments that won in Brown and Bowling. But Thurgood Marshall is correctly remembered as the principal prevailing winning advocate in the Brown case. And as the clerk said this morning, the time had come, the Brown case was won because the court was ready to take the step, and it's not something that was won by one sentence or another in Marshall's oral argument. But the vision of this litigation, the campaign that culminated in Brown, began with Marshall's mentors and then was taken over by him. Thurgood Marshall, interestingly, came to talk in the amphitheater where we will be tomorrow in the summer of 1957 about the implementation now that the victory had been won. Thurgood Marshall at Chautauqua criticized the churches of America for not having done enough between 1954 and 1957 to capture and win the victory by preaching it at the pulpits. I'm not a preacher, and this is not quite a pulpit, but Thurgood Marshall is most definitely a spirit with us this evening. A third spirit, a definite preacher with us this evening, is the Reverend Oliver Brown. He's been mentioned briefly. I think he'll be mentioned in more detail tomorrow. I hope he will be. He was simply one of the brave parents who took on the fight, who volunteered his name, his time, his physical safety in an investment in the equality of his own children. There's nothing more fundamental that one can think about a parent doing than stepping up for one's kids. And the Reverend Oliver Brown, the parents of guests I will introduce in a moment, is a spirit with us this evening. Another group of spirits with us this evening, represented by their clerks, represented by the decision, are the justices of the Supreme Court. And I will tell you just a bit about the 9. Robert Jackson, I will virtually skip. I think you know that, and there are so many ways we've continued to talk and learn about that, but it's always the case that Jackson's spirit is present in this place. It's certainly true this evening. The other 8 who were part of Brown in May 1954 physically were in this place just a matter of months later, because Jackson returned from the hospital bed to participate visibly in the unanimity of the court on May 17th, and then died on October 9th, 1954, which led his 8 surviving colleagues to travel as a body, as a court, to Jamestown for the funeral and to Little Frewsburg for the burial of their colleague Robert Jackson. Following that ceremony, the justices repaired to the Moonbrook Country Club, where they were hosted by the Jamestown Bar Association for a lunch, and then, with a little time to kill and something they wanted to see, guess what they did? They drove up that side of the lake. They came around the top of the lake through Mayville, past the cemetery where Tourget rests. They came down this side, and they came in this gate because they wanted to see Chautauqua Institution. They'd all heard of it, and none had visited the place except Stanley Reed. The others expected, I believe, Methodist ministers in tents pitched in mud. What they found, of course, had progressed somewhat since those 19th century circumstances, and they were mightily impressed. They visited the amphitheater. They talked about the many historic events that had occurred there, the great speakers, Franklin Roosevelt, I Hate War, Theodore Roosevelt, etc., who have spoken from that podium. And they spent time simply soaking up this place, which gave them, in that tragically closing moment, a new and deeper understanding of their dear colleague, Robert Jackson. Now, they were Sherman Minton, Harold Burton, Hugo Black, William Douglas, Tom Clark, Stanley Reed, Felix Frankfurter, and Earl Warren. A few words about a couple of them. Hugo Black was from Alabama. Hugo Black was the justice from the deepest part in the South, whose home turf would have, of course, the deepest problems absorbing the Brown decision and implementing this in the years that followed. Hugo Black was one of the quickest and most decisive votes to reverse Plessy versus Ferguson in that case. His spirit, with all of theirs, is with us this evening. His alacrity in knowing how that case should be decided and his pressure to decide that first and fast deserves noting. Tom Clark was from Texas, a state with segregation. He'd lived it and known it, and he too wrestled with this question and was part of the decision. Stanley Reed from Kentucky, a border state, had lived with segregation and wrestled with this issue and ultimately made a brave decision not to dissent because the time had come and the court needed unanimously to do this as a decision. Stanley Reed was the one who'd previously been to Chautauqua because his friend Jackson had hosted him here in the summer of 1937. Jackson was an assistant attorney general. Reed was the Solicitor General of the United States. The event was based across the highway at the golf club because Stanley Reed was a golfer. And they played, and then there was a dinner, and Reed spoke. And from that point forward, Reed, a man of the Kentucky country, understood the beauty of this country. Felix Frankfurter, Jackson's dearest friend on the court, was part of that group in October 1954. And of course, Earl Warren, the Chief Justice, led that group. Earl Warren was somebody who Robert Jackson had gotten to know well during the 7 preceding summers, because in addition to coming home to this region, what Jackson did every year from 1947 through the end of his life was spent 2 weeks in the woods of Northern California at the Bohemian Grove. Many stories about exactly what men do and where there. But Warren and Jackson raised a few and talked into the hours of the night. This is Warren as governor of California and Jackson as a justice years before Brown. I think that bond, in a way I can't begin to document, played a role in Jackson's excitement about Warren becoming chief in the fall of 1953 and Jackson's embrace of the wisdom of the Warren opinion in May of 1954. Now, those are the bulk of the spirits. I'll mention 2 more. Greg mentioned that I clerked for Judge Leon Higginbotham my first 2 years out of law school. No longer with us. Leon Higginbotham was a giant, one of the brave early African-American lawyers to emerge from an Ivy League school in the 1950s, and himself the counsel of his regional NAACP involved in Pennsylvania desegregation litigation. When I began my clerkship, Judge Higginbotham made a point of grabbing me and my co-clerks very early in that first year and taking us to the judge's elevator and saying, "You need to meet Collins." Didn't know what that meant. We went down the elevator a couple of floors, and his colleague, whose home chambers was in Wilmington, Delaware, was there in Philadelphia for oral argument week. This gentleman's name was Collins Seitz. He was a federal judge of many years by the time I was being introduced to him by my boss in the 1980s. But the point of that introduction was that Collins Seitz had been a state court judge before he was a federal judge. And he had been a state court judge, a chancellor is what they called it, in the state of Delaware. And here's why both of those spirits are in the room tonight and why that introduction was so important to Leon Higginbotham, African American, as he introduced us to Collins Seitz, Caucasian American. The 5 Brown cases were the federal case from the District of Columbia, Bowling, and 4 state cases, South Carolina, Kansas, and the Delaware case. I'm forgetting one. Virginia, of course, and the Delaware case. The 4 other cases were coming on appeal to the court from adverse decisions in the lower court. The plaintiffs had lost, the parents had lost, the children had lost in 4 of the 5 cases. The exception was the Delaware case, where the chancellor, a man whose own windows were firebombed out of his house, who had to relocate his own children as he handled that case, who took Plessy versus Ferguson seriously and as far as the Supreme Court before Brown permitted him to and demanded equalization, had been Collins J. Seitz. Leon Higginbotham explained that all to me as a young law clerk. And in a way, this whole 2 days of wonderful events for me began there. And Leon Higginbotham and Collins Seitz are 2 spirits with us this evening. The third group that I get to introduce is the sisters. On this, I may be brief. Linda Brown Thompson was a young student, and Cheryl Brown Henderson was approaching school age when their father agreed to become one of the plaintiffs in Topeka, Kansas, challenging the segregation of the elementary schools. They won the case. They embody the lead name and thus carry a tremendous legacy which they have embraced in this body of 5 decisions. One of the most exciting things I learned as I prepared for this, watching a speech that Cheryl gave earlier this month at Yale University, was the perspective that they have. And of course, we will hear more about this tomorrow. She made a point of stressing that the caption of the case is called Brown et al. Versus Board of Education et al. They are the named lead party, but this case was about everyone who was a party And in each of the 5 states, it was a class action. So not even the participants limited the universe. It was parenthood on behalf of childhood that was the plaintiff at the bar. And that is the legacy that they embrace as they travel, as they speak, as they lead their own foundation, as they've developed an educational center in Topeka, literally in the school that was one of the issues in the case. It is an honor to welcome Linda Brown Thompson and Cheryl Brown Henderson to Chautauqua Institution and the Robert Jackson Center.